Firstly, I'd just like to thank Nuffield Australia for the opportunity to undergo this scholarship. It's obviously been an amazing prospect to travel the world with 8 of your closest international and domestic friends, meeting all sorts of amazing businesses and people along the way. I'd like to thank my wife, Jamie. Her forever understanding and patient nature has certainly been challenged in some of these situations I've been in, and obviously all the Nuffield associates and cooperators, and we'll just move right into it. So my background, I'm a broadacre dryland farmer. We're on a family farm in northwest New South Wales, predominantly growing wheat, cotton, chickpeas and some beef on the side. In 2005 we found ourselves in an exploration licence owned by the state. So what it was to extract, to investigate the possibility of coal extraction under our lands. In 2007, so that took in half our farm, and then in 2007 we found ourselves in another exploration licence owned by the Chinese state government, being Shenhua Watermark.
Sorry, just take it closer.
Righto.
Thanks.
Well, Shenhua Watermark, which meant that basically we didn't have any acres of land that weren't involved in some exploration licence. Just some quick statistics from my area. So basically, you know, it's a reasonably productive area. It's not a significantly large area of New South Wales, but it's very productive. Just under $9 million worth of local economy. Agriculture contributes $2.5 billion to this. Mineral and energy's, you know, $1.7 billion, and it's the third largest coal reserve in New South Wales. It's got significant coal bed methane reserves. Overlying all this, however, it's got a really significant aquifer structure that sits on top of these resources, and it's the headwater of the Murray-Darling Basin. I just had to pick a line basically. Obviously the energy debate was pretty significant, so I just thought I'd take 4 main points out of it. I just wanted to have a look at how legislative performance affects these developments on the ground. I wanted to have a look at the social licence that these companies operate in when they go into a new area, how they have done business in the past and how they plan to do business in the future. I think will be two entirely different ways. I then had to look at the value of the agricultural asset and the energy asset, what returns to the state were generated through royalties, and I wanted to look at the cumulative effects of extraction over the life of the project. I chose to focus on fossil fuels because that was pretty pertinent to our area. The reason for my topic, obviously domestically Australia has significant reserves. Inadvertently, however, these reserves are encroaching on prime ag land. What we found in our area was obviously capital, finance availability is directly related to securities held by banking institutions over the water and the land. So if you have on your balance sheet water at a specific value and it disappears, you've obviously got an issue with your lending securities. I wanted to have a look at the rate at which these sort of markets develop once energy comes to town. I wanted to remove myself from the media hypersensitivity I thought was, pretty pertinent to what was happening. Basically, if the media had not a good story, they chose to run with it more often than not. And obviously I wanted to develop a non-biased, educated opinion on this. Just recapping, obviously in our situation, the water and the land and the value of ag and mining to coexist in the one area, obviously trying to derive value out of each of the assets, the total value of the resource, what it actually looked like, how value was derived out of that asset, obviously that environmental mineral asset, and then what value the current environment actually had, so culture and heritage, vegetation, specific areas, endangered species and the like. One of the most significant areas I travelled to was Gillette in Wyoming. So basically the Powder River Basin supplies energy for 42 states of the US. They extract somewhere in excess of 420 million tonne of coal per annum. It's a fairly transient population. The local town is 31,000 people. They have 12 active mines. The reason I ended up there was it's a semi-arid environment, so basically they're large-scale breeder operations. A lot of the cattle blocks I was on basically breeding Angus calves for the feedlot trade that, you know, got trucked down either north into Canada or to some of the yards through Nebraska and down into Texas. But what I found here was basically the focus that was placed on the water resource. So it was all artesian water that this coal resource sat on top of. Very arid climate, 10-inch rainfall, and I just wanted to have a look at actually what happened here. But what I found when I got there, we had a population that was presuming that they were going to have a Clinton administration. They were resigned to the fact that a Clinton administration would shut the industry down, and basically the industry was in free fall. And the reason that was happening was gas was obviously a lower value commodity relative to power generation ability, and inadvertently it was devaluing their domestic coal market. To give you some sort of concept on what it's like to move that sort of volume of coal, they were loading 100 trains per day, 24 hours a day, and those trains were 1,600 metres long. It was a very significant development. 60 miles from that, I met with two fairly senior landholders, basically both on cattle operations. They'd been through the legislative process 20 years ago. So you've got Gary Packard on the left and the Wests on the right. Just a few things from Gary. Basically, his great-great-grandfather had walked cattle up there from Texas. He had a very strong emotive attachment to the land. This for me was, if anything, a light bulb moment, because it made me realise that to develop these resources was bigger than just the economics of the project. It was more about how people perceive value in what they owned. And a lot of it, obviously, when you're in the US, you've got a very patriotic population that's very much attached to their land, their asset. Obviously, they're operating under different sorts of mineral rights, which means a lot of these people actually derive great value from these assets being developed. What happened in these two situations, however, they signed different levels of contracts with the companies that were extracting the coal bed methane, which is what both these places were developed on. The life of the gas had left, and what they were left with was no artesian water and no cash flow. Bill and Marge West actually ended up with a reverse osmosis plant in their backyard because they didn't actually have any prospect of water for their farm. I wanted to go and find a better story, basically where legislation agriculturally operated better for both stakeholders, being the person extracting the resource and the people that own the land. I met with Bruce Stevens down there with DNR. So the DNR in the US, Department of Natural Resources, are very passionate. As far as they're concerned, any resource owned by the state is the property of the US people. So what it means is you have someone that's looking after the resource, directly being passionate and obviously getting true outcomes for the people. If a company does the wrong thing, as far as they're concerned, they're stealing from the US people, which obviously is a very significant thing. This site here on the left, that was strip mined in 2009 by Peabody Energy. Obviously you see here in Australia, very large open cast mines, photos of them. You know, do you want this to happen to your area? It is actually very real in Australia, only for the fact that we don't have any overarching legislation to actually make sure that when the process of extraction is finalised, those lands can be used for another purpose. This field on the right is on a farm owned basically by the ANSONs there. They're a significant farming family that build their business around regenerating lands from coal mines. This Surface Control Mining Reclamation Act is the legislation that's getting things done over there. So it stipulates that leases must be restored to a condition capable of supporting the uses that were prior to mining or higher or better uses. The environmental bond structure is something that I think the Australian government fails to realise. This could have very true positive outcomes for development here in Australia. Basically, three types of bonds are developed in the US. Two most important being the collateral bond and the self bond. So when a mining lease is issued after an exploration licence is deemed that there is a resource worthy of development, 12.5% of the gross turnover is paid to the state as insurance for any sort of environmental impact, if you like. The issue here was that a lot of the more significant companies were self-bonding. Peabody Energy down Powder River obviously had big bonds put aside to reclaim the lands after they finished extraction, but obviously GFC hit and these companies ended up into voluntary receivership. So there are some issues with this type of legislation. Just recapping, this is Doug Anson here in this photo. I don't know how clear it is, but very significant business. They're farming, just over 20,000 acres, corn, soy, turkeys, cover cropping business, seed business as well. It's, best practice business. They had a 36-child care facility on farm just to give them something to do in their spare time. But what I found here was that the demonstration of the actual mechanics of the way the land was regenerated, they'd sort of moved from a process that everything was pulled with scraper and basically compaction was killing them. So what they found was if they were picking it up with excavators, putting it in trucks and then pushing it with low ground pressure dozers, they were getting very real outcomes to make the land productive in under 5 years. Obviously this is a 40-inch rainfall, so you've got to take these things into context. It's not going to suit all environments. Obviously I've been in the US for a good 6 or 8 weeks at this stage, and everyone was saying you need to end up at Fort McMurray just to get a handle on how big energy is up here in North, Canada. So I ended up to these oil sands. So basically an oil sand is a sand that is basically soaked in bitumen. What I found when I ended up there was we're way above the agricultural line of production, but just to get an understanding on how big energy actually is in North America. I'm standing there on a site, and for want of a better word, he said, probably you don't want to use your flash here because if we go up it'll potentially be a Kim Jong-il episode, but they're significant developments. They're $10 billion US in excess when they're built, and this is just to give you a handle. This is one site of 7 at Fort Mac. That's a flyover, but this for me was a bit of an interesting one because obviously they're operating under environmental legislation similar to agriculture. If you're in agriculture and you have a 250 mil oil spill, it's an EPA reportable offence. If you're pulling oil sand at Fort Mac, their evaporation and tailings ponds, that one on the left there, that's pure oil sitting on top of that water. When we were flying over it, I asked what the little things were out in the middle of the water, and he said to me, oh, that's for the birds, because he said if the birds drink that water, he said it'll kill them. Basically, they were scare guns sitting on top of the water. The second photo is basically for all the canola growers in the room. That's elemental sulphur as a byproduct of the process. So next time your local landmark tells you that sulphur is short, it's probably not a bad, it's probably not a bad thing. It's not as short as everyone thinks. Final thing I focused on in North America just to have a look at was basically the fracking debate. Same thing, a lot of media hype up here, water resources are the problem. They're the issue. The map on the left there is a 20 mile by 20 mile square. There's 800 wellheads in that 20 miles, so obviously 30 kilometres, 900 square K. There's 800 wellheads on that. I was meeting here with Mary Peacock, and basically what she was saying was they'd had water and it had dissipated. That previous slide there, that drill site was about 400 metres from her house. That drilling company had basically come through her land, but because they were accessing Crown land, they didn't need to have any sort of access arrangement in place to access the land. This has been going on obviously for 30 years, so you're seeing a more mature market, but you're seeing what happens when the overarching legislation doesn't quite tick all the boxes. If you base it on pure economics, obviously the numbers look pretty good to develop, a fracked oil well if you're in Canada. But for me, it was just understanding how perceived value is between landholders. So basically, just as in summary, the outcomes I think that would make for a better development, for a more, more equal development here in Australia is better landholder engagement and negotiations critical for the success of both stakeholders. That legislation needs to be to get real outcomes. Basically, any sort of conflict as a result of people misunderstanding legislation or not being able to come to a real arrangement just basically stalls developments. The farmer's attachment to the land is not very well understood by the resource companies. It's very hard to measure, a landholder's how he perceives the value of his land, or they perceive the value of their land, a family. And companies don't fully understand how the impacts of the development change people's perception of what's being done. Fair and equitable compensatory processes, obviously, they come down to mineral exploration rights. Basically, if you hold your mineral rights, well, it's a different outcome if you're in Texas. If you're sitting there talking to Dave Delaney at King Ranch, he tells you that basically if they're coming to use our land to extract, gas, they're coming on our terms because we own our land. It's just a different conversation you have. Good community, clear consultation and transparency critical to get these sort of developments up. Just the fallback, basically, I didn't see a situation where prime ag land, groundwater or surface water, there was a good outcome, and basically any of these should negate a significant development. I'd recommend that we should be able to measure how current land use looks, and it's critical to integrate into the resource development proposal to get a sustainable outcome. There are opportunities for vertical integration with gas supplies for the process of developing energy and for the development of ag, obviously done in a sustainable manner. And obviously this is all under better government legislation. The environmental bonding proposal obviously seems to be working in North America as the market is more mature and people getting more attuned to what actually happens under proper legislation. And it's crucial that the implications of environmental default actually matter to these companies. Thank you very much for your time, and I've just got a couple of small discussion points there that might enhance some questions in question time. Thank you very much.